welcome. Are you guys excited to talk about design systems? My favorite topic. All right, let's see if this works. No. Yes, okay. Awesome. So before we get started, I'd actually love to see a show of hands of anybody who's currently using a design system, design language, style guide right now. Yes, okay, great. Actually, it's more than I expected. Awesome. Anybody not using one but aspiring to, wants to, it's a twinkle in their eye? Yes, okay, good, awesome. So you're in the right place. I'm super excited. So like Lara just mentioned, I'm another Lara, and she mentioned I'm a senior manager of product design at HubSpot, and I'm super excited to talk to you today about my experience building the HubSpot design system canvas. I've been working on it for it'll be 3 years tomorrow. Been working on it, and so I'm really excited to share lessons learned, not only building it, but how we've actually been able to use it at scale, maintain it, keep it alive and evergreen. And so first, let's talk a little bit about why you even need a design system. I mean, some of this is a little bit obvious, but I feel like it's worth mentioning. So when I first started at HubSpot, we had 2 style guides. We had our marketing style guide from our first product, and then we had built another product, our sales and CRM product, and we built another style guide because it was built on a new framework. It was more new. They wanted to be more modern, which I totally understand. But it caused a lot of confusion for our customers who were using both products. And not only were there visual inconsistencies, but there was also inconsistencies in small behaviors. So it was definitely not a great user experience for our customers. But then there's this other benefit that I don't think we talk about enough, which is the benefit for your team. So another quick story from when I first started at HubSpot. I was a designer on our ads tool. And I remember vividly inheriting the sketch file from the previous designer. And I needed to design something super simple, a flow, a modal with a button. I get into the sketch file, and I go to grab a button, and the whole thing moves. It was a screenshot. So that's where we were 3 years ago. So I was like, do I take a screenshot of the screenshot, like, and perpetuate this chaos, or do I actually rebuild the modal, rebuild the button? But that's a huge red flag. That's a huge signal that there was a lot of time being spent recreating every single screen. I mean, I can't even imagine building a whole page like that. And it's wasted time that designers were spending on that instead of actually solving user problems. Maybe they don't even need a modal. Maybe they don't even need a button. What are they trying to do? And that's where we really want to focus our designers. So there's another really big benefit there that we're focused on the users. And so I keep saying this word design system. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. I think there's a lot of terminology used around this, and there's actually a lot of design systems out there. It's not a new concept. There's Google Material Design, Intuit's Harmony, IBM's Carbon. The list goes on. But what's interesting is that sometimes there's different definitions there. Sometimes it's just a visual style guide. Sometimes it's a coded component library. Sometimes it has guidelines on how to use it. But I want to be really clear that as we were building ours, we wanted to make sure it was actually all of those things. We felt like we can't just have one piece of that. You need it to all be consistent for it to be a good experience. So when we talk about a design system, we're talking about the visual styles through to the implementation of the coded components with guidelines and patterns on how to use it consistently, and also a process on how to keep it updated. How do you make changes? That's something I don't think we've really seen before. Okay, let's get to the good stuff. All right, so we put together 5 lessons learned. And so we're going to start off with only design what's necessary. So you might be thinking like, yeah, duh, this one's fairly obvious. But I like to think of this as when you're maybe moving to a new house or a new apartment, maybe you're downsizing, and you need to kind of get rid of stuff or donate stuff, and the day sneaks up on you, so you end up just packing it all up, moving it all, then unpacking it, and then getting rid of it. It's not ideal. You really want to make sure you're spending that time up front going through it so that you're only packing and moving the things that you want. And I'll give you an example. So when we went through all of our components, we did a component audit of all of our apps. So we're going to use buttons as our example here. These were all of the button-ish type stuff we were using in our product at the time. So you can start with the fairly obvious stuff here. We had about 6 different primary buttons, which means we had no primary buttons because that totally defeats the purpose. So that's an easy one that we were able to consolidate. But then we took we took a look at this again with a little bit of a deeper lens. We were looking at clarity. We were looking at purpose. Like, do some of these things even need to be buttons? Like, what is that new thing? Like, should that be a label? So I think that was the opportunity to really just make sure we were designing what was necessary, and we were able to consolidate it down. And so we were really lucky that we were able to do a visual redesign at the same time we were building this system. That's not always the case, but I would actually recommend this regardless. But you can see here that when we brought it over to the new styles, we didn't have to design all of those things in the new style and then get rid of them. We did that first. And now it's painfully obvious which one is our primary button, which is great. And just another note on this one is that a lot of times I think it can be really hard to get started with a design system or a design language because you're thinking about all the things you need to design in this new world, maybe all the things that are to come, and you can kind of get kind of lost in the future and not actually just start. Just start with what you have, start with what your users are currently using, what they currently need, and that will get you really far. Okay, don't pull the sheet off the car. So I was practicing this talk with my partner, and he was like, no one's going to get this metaphor. So I kept it. so stay with me. So when you're launching something, so especially we were able to do a redesign at the same time as our design system, like I mentioned, you want to do this big reveal. You want to pull the sheet off the car and get the gasp of the audience. And there's also another way to launch things like products, which is a little bit at a time with the ability to get feedback. So as you may know if you work in product, that it's really good to do that. And so I think what was really interesting is we didn't really have a choice. So at HubSpot at the time, we had about 30 small product teams working on the product. And they were actually able to prioritize and decide on what they were working on individually. And so actually the effort and coordination it was going to take to do a big reveal was impossible. So we had to roll it out in pieces. But what we did as a design team is we said, well, that's actually an opportunity. Why don't we take a couple of the newer apps that don't have as many users in them, so it won't be super disruptive. Let's try it out and let's learn from it. And we're really, really glad that we did because, of course, we got feedback. And so there was some feedback that we anticipated getting. Our new design language was a little bit more airy. It had a lot more white space, and we kind of knew that that was by design. But then we got some feedback that we weren't anticipating, things like contrast and accessibility. Our text was too light. But it's OK, because we were able to fix it. So we were able to kind of make that request. And through the way that it was built, we actually used tokens. So we just changed it here, and it updated everywhere. So that was some sort of magic that I'm not going to pretend to understand. But what's really amazing is that we were able to make those changes before we rolled it out to the rest of our product. That was really important because at that point, not as many users were using it. OK. Find and use a common language. OK, so like I mentioned, we sort of work on these small teams at HubSpot. And so front-end engineers and designers are working and collaborating together. And a lot of times, that seems to be going really well. You're working together. You think you're on the same page. And then it's built, and you're like, ooh, not exactly what I had in mind. Close, though. I see where you were coming from. And so what we noticed is that designers and front-end engineers were not actually speaking the same language. And so we really wanted to make that felt actually like something that we could solve. Let's just make sure we're defining the stuff, we're speaking the same language. And so an example I have for this is, so say you're a designer, you mocked something up with like a gray-blue color. In our old style guide, developer comes here, and they're like, which, like gray-blue, gray-blue, gray, gray-blue, gray, lighter? Which one is it? So you can see why this was certainly confusing, why things were a little bit off, and why actually new stuff got created, because it was sort of like, it's not the slightly gray that I was looking for. So this is one of the things we aim to tackle in our new system. So for example, using colors, we not only pared down our colors, but we provided a little bit of a language around it. So a good example is Calypso is our link color. It's our clickable color, and so we can kind of talk about that. We don't say, hex LU 7.3, So it's actually really nice, and it's created a nice collaboration between designers and front-end engineers. And also Heffalump and Battleship can't get confused, like gray-blue, gray-blue, gray. And so in this exercise, we actually interviewed 6 designers and 6 front-end engineers. We asked them a little bit about their process, and then we played a really fun game called What Would You Call This? And because I have you here today, I thought we would play a few rounds, if you'll humor me. It's really easy. I'm going to show you a component, and you just shout out what you think it's called, and we'll see what the results were from our game. Are you ready to play? Cool. All right, shout it out. What's this? Yes, that one was easy. Okay, great. They get harder. What would you call this? Alert, I heard notifications, pop-up. Okay, cool. So we don't even agree. That's great. You're right. You're all right. Right? So this was a good example. Toast is interesting because that was like called UI Toast. It was something the way it was built, so developers were talking about it like toast, and we were all like, what are you talking about? So we actually picked notification. We felt like it was the most clear, and now that's what they're called, which is great. One last round. Bear with me. What would you call this? Yeah, great, perfect. So similar to the response we got, I don't know. Sideways hamburger, I don't know. So cool. So this one's obviously like a pretty extreme example that we were like, okay, if nobody knows what this is, we should probably redesign it, which we did, and we used words, which you should do. It's a column switcher. But as you can see, that was great information. We really cleared up a lot of confusion when we did that. And the other thing we did, because we're designers and researchers, we did some card sorting on the components. And so what came from this was some documentation. So we know that designers need to work in a vector file, so we use Sketch at HubSpot. So we knew that there was always going to be some sort of Sketch file, and we knew that front-end engineers needed a coded component library, so we knew those things we actually couldn't combine completely, but we at least wanted them to be using the same language, calling things the same words, and also being organized in the same way. So we were trying to find something you can find it in both. Okay, and then there's, happiness. Great. Okay, cool. Make it easy to do the right thing. Okay, so if anybody's read up or done any research on human behavior, particularly human behavior change, you know that it's really hard. It's really hard to get humans to change their behavior. So this lesson is really about making sure that you're going to where people are already working. So in that process where we were interviewing designers and developers, we were actually asking them, what's your current process? Where do you go now to find this information? And that was really helpful, because then we could say, cool, where are those opportunities where you're already going that we can help guide you to do the right thing? And from that, like I just mentioned some of this documentation, but what came from that was that a lot of the front-end engineers were using this coded component library, which was much more geared towards engineers when we first started, and then designers were obviously using a sketch kit. But what we decided was we really need a single source of truth. We need one place that everybody can look and agree upon as our source of truth. So that is our UI library. You can actually see a public version of it at canvas.hubspot.com if you want to check it out. But that really is, we sort of say code is queen. So if you have sort of dispute between the mockups and the code, it's always the code. It's what's built. It's the component. And we've created a process for designers to be able to update that if it's really not what they want. But at the end of the day, the UI library is our single source of truth. And then, so speaking of making it really easy to do the right thing, I think that we found that, again, there was just times where there were decisions being made, but it's just really hard to keep things consistent. So a good example is every time we have buttons next to each other in our product, they're 12 pixels apart. So we were like, why don't we just make that happen in the code? So finding opportunities so that there isn't this moment of, okay, the front engineer has to go in and like measure, and the designer has to remember 12 pixels, like it just works. And so finding these small things add up, and I think finding those opportunities that you can make those things a system, the better. Another example of how we sort of made it really easy to do the right thing, we had header components, we had side navs, we had tables, we had all the pieces, the Lego pieces, but we still noticed that things were slightly off. And so I was chatting with one of our front-end engineers, and I was like, can you just make the whole page a component? And he was like, yes, I can. It's as easy as that. So, it did take a little bit of work to go through the different pages that we had in our app and create a little bit of a system around that. What are the types of pages that we need, and what are the configurations? But turns out we didn't actually need that many, and now it's one single component. So now it's pixel perfect the same, but also if we change anything about it or make any decisions, it updates across the board. So it's really exciting. And then another thing is just, guidelines, decisions that we're making in the way that we want to use it, putting it right in the UI library. It's important for the designers to know this, but it's also important for the front-end engineers to know this. Everybody should be the evangelist for this stuff, making sure that it's consistent for the user and seeking out that information themselves. And then lastly, patterns. So unfortunately, not everything can be a component someday. But until then, there's still different types of UX patterns that you still need to be able to look at the context. A human still needs to look at it and make a decision. So we just decided, let's just start documenting what those things are. So a good example, saving. Sure, you can use the same save and cancel button everywhere, but sometimes it auto-saves, sometimes it doesn't. There's some subtleties that you still have to make a decision about. And so we documented that it's in the same place. So if anybody is looking around, they can find this information, and it's documented. Okay, lastly, define a process, not a project. So I think it can be really, it can just be natural to want to have a project to do either a redesign or to create a design system. And to be fair, we did too. That's where we started. We very quickly realized we're going to be doing the same project every year. And I don't think anybody really wanted to do that. And so I love this slide because it shows you not only the timeline of the process we went through, but the different stages and the different decisions we made. And I think a lot of times when people talk about a redesign, they talk about like picking the colors and the font. That was 2 weeks. We were done. And then like the hard part happened, right? Actually implementing it, actually making it evergreen was the hard part. And you can see here, we first had the sketch kit, then we launched the apps, got some feedback, then we created the UI library. So it wasn't all at once. Give yourself time to pull this stuff together. But what was most interesting was, okay, how are we going to keep this updated? How do we make changes? And that's where we evolved into actually having a team and a process. So the team, let's talk a little bit about the team. So our Canvas team is made up of 4 designers and 4 front-end engineers. The front-end is a service engineering group. These 4 folks are actually dedicated to this, so they're dedicated to our UI components, which is really great and really awesome that we have an engineering team that really invests in this. But what's really interesting is the 4 designers are not full-time. They are a rotational. They're providing a service rotationally. They're still designing for their teams, and they do this for 6 months. And so there's a couple reasons we decided to do that. I mean, the obvious reason was we didn't actually have the ability to staff somebody full-time on this. But we realized that actually being able to do this rotational service was great because then everybody on the team spends time on it. They contribute to it. They understand how it works. If they want to, once they leave the team, they're an evangelist, and they know how to make changes. And it just brings in different experience levels, different interests. Like when we had somebody who was really interested in motion or accessibility. When they were on the team, we focused on those things. It brings different parts of our app together. We have over 40 designers now. And so I think it actually worked out, and I would actually recommend it. And we probably will get to a day where we might need somebody dedicated for some of the process stuff. But I feel strongly that we'll continue on with this rotational program for the team. Okay, so cool. So what does this team actually do? What are their responsibilities? So I'll talk a little bit about that. So their primary responsibility is keeping it up to date. So there are requests coming in. This is our UI library, and you can see there's quite a bit of things you can actually do or request from it. You can request a new component. You can request a change to a component. You can report a bug. You can actually request assets. We have a full-time illustrator. She's amazing, Sue. So if you need something there, you can actually request to make changes to the documentation. So it's a little open source in that way. Like if you want to change something or add to it, you can, which is really interesting. So I'm actually going to go through an example of requesting a new component to show you guys what that looks like. Okay, so from our UI library, it brings you into GitHub. So we use GitHub primarily because it's actually where our front-end engineers work, but it's also a great system for documenting. So if we're having discussions, we make decisions, you can close out a ticket, but it stays there, and you can go back and find it and say, why did we make that decision a year ago? And you can go back and see why. And then it's also easy to pass that along to the front-end engineers who are implementing it. So a couple things to note about these requests. They've evolved over time. So to be very clear, they are not, it's not an order-taking service. It's not like, hey, I'd love to see this component. The designers and the front-end engineers on teams are doing that work. They should be invested and understand their use cases to be requesting it, so that the process is really about review and implementation. And once that comes in, it comes into our queue. You can see this. The team meets every Friday for an hour, and they do a couple of things. One is they triage out new issues, which I'll talk about in a second, and then they'll review issues. And you can see here, you can't see because it's a horizontal scroll that way, but this is the whole process from design all the way through engineering, if you were to scroll. Cool, so let's talk a little bit about that triage process. So I'm gonna call out Tram, she's here. So Tram is on our Canvas team, and she's a Canvas designer. So if during triage she gets an issue, she has a couple of responsibilities. It's actually a little bit like a mini design process. You're sort of digging into the issue, understanding what the use cases are, and being able to represent that issue at review on Friday. So she's either talking to the person who submitted it or a couple of teams if that's the case, and really facilitating and getting it ready so that review is really effective. And then during review, there's also a couple of things that we evaluate. So one, is there enough information in the request? Hopefully the triager actually gets you to so that this isn't a problem, but sometimes things slip through. Why doesn't a component we already have not work? To me, that's like the #1 reason why we close out issues, is that we have something like it, maybe you didn't know, or maybe we're just saying this is the way we've decided to do it. Until we have a more compelling reason, that's what we're going to do. And then how does making this component create leverage for multiple teams? So that's another thing we see, is sometimes we'll see people submitting issues, and really they just need like a design review, but then their team can build it, because it's not actually creating leverage to be a component that's used across teams. So we'll see that a couple of times. And then obviously accessibility, translation, and technical considerations and states and things like that are also considered in this process. And then once it's accepted, we update our sketch kit. We try to do that weekly. And we email out subscribers who want to know about those updates. We actually use our own marketing automation tool, which is really fun. And then it goes into that fast queue. So I have a nice little diagram here of that process. So how a bill becomes law. It is a fairly democratic process. We want to make sure people feel empowered to make changes, but there's actually a process. And what's also interesting is that the process lives on even when people change in and out. And that was really important for us, because we knew that that was going to happen. And it's also something that's just about shared understanding, right? We understand and trust the system, either because we've worked on it, or it's just very transparent about what's happening. And that's it. So these are the 5 lessons learned, building and growing a design system. There's obviously many other lessons we learned, but I feel like these are the ones that really attributed to the success of it still being alive today, 3 years later. I'll leave it up there for a second if you guys want to take pictures. There's a ton more details that I had to skip over, but they're in we have 3 Medium posts about it, about even the different phases. Mariah's is more about the redesign itself. Julie's is more about that coded component library, and then mine digs into the process a little bit more. And that is it. I wanted to leave time for questions. I don't know if you guys have any, but I know that this can be a really fun topic to talk about. But that's it. Okay, how should we do this? Oh, okay, they're in charge.
Hi there.
Hi.
Sorry. That was awesome. One question regarding like content requirements or even voice and tone guidelines. Do you see those kind of fitting within the design system, or do you kind of see them in their own unique space?
Yes, we actually have somebody here from our UX content team, so that's a great question. We have that as part of our UI library. So we actually have a whole voice and tone section. And I would say right now it is a little bit more, it's written guidelines, but we are working with our UX content team to make that even more interactive, cover more use cases, almost its own component library. But the other thing we did recently with Emily was go through all of the examples we have for our components and make sure that those are also well written, because a lot of times people will just pull stuff in. And so we tried to, again, make it really easy to do the right thing, go to where people are to provide those guidelines. But yes, absolutely, super important. I feel like I'm not in charge.
Sorry, question back here. So you mentioned how hard it is to change, human behavior. So with engineers who aren't used to a design system,
yep.
like there's a challenge there to get buy-in. So what are some of the strategies you use to get buy-in from the engineering team to do something differently?
Yes, actually, so that's great. I'm glad you brought that up. So we were in a unique situation where engineering was actually leading a lot of this effort. So unfortunately, we didn't have to do a ton of that. They were actually really excited because it was causing a lot of pain. Like I mentioned, it's like 30 different groups working, all on their own things, and so they felt pain already on the front-end infrastructure side of things, and they wanted to create this at least coded component library. And so we saw that as an opportunity. We piggybacked on that and said, cool, while we're at it, let's redesign and make sure we're thinking about this holistically. So it's kind of a cop-out answer, but yeah, you do have to make sure engineering is on board for sure.
Hi, could you talk a little bit more about you talked about the rotational program to have multiple designers sort of having a hand in the process. Can you talk more about how that worked out and
Sure.
how
Yep.
that worked? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So it wasn't always like that. It started out as a couple really passionate designers working on it, and that probably went on for about a year. And so that was at the point where we said, we can't keep doing this. And we were growing as a design team, so there was actually a lot of interest from other designers to contribute and be on it. And so that's when I actually sort of just tried that out as a pilot. I said, well, why don't we just make it a little bit more formalized and has a time limit, and then there's a little more of like an onboarding process, there's some documentation, make it more of a thing. And I want to say we've done at least 4 or 5 rotations now, and still going strong, and it's actually pretty volunteer-based. Like I said, we have a lot of designers, which is great, and they're always like, can I sign up for the next round or whatever? So we actually haven't gone through everybody yet, but I'm interested to see what happens there, because I've actually had a bunch of people say, can I go back on it? Can I do it again? So it feels like it's something that is really valuable to do, and people are excited to do it. Did that answer your question, or do you have more? Yeah.
I have the mic.
Okay.
Do you want to go next?
Hi.
Do you go first?
Am I up? Okay.
Okay, sure.
That was awesome. Thank you so much for that. I'm actually going through a very similar situation where our engineering department actually were really pushing for this because they were having a lot of pain points. So as we're, the first 2 weeks in essentially, some of the things that we've been thinking about are mobile first versus desktop is one of the things. We have an enterprise product, so with all the dashboards, it would really make sense to think about the desktop experience, but of course now everyone thinks about mobile first. So
Yeah.
I'm curious about that, and then also one other thing, thinking about marketing versus product, all the cross-channel touch points, email, how much did you consider that as you were going through your
Yes,
guidelines?
2 great questions. Okay, so first, mobile. So we have a separate mobile team. Our product's B2B software, and it's mostly marketing, sales, CRM software. And so a lot of work is actually done on the desktop. So we were really more focused on desktop. And a lot of our components are responsive. Like the front end as a service team does some of that. They make sure things sort of work a little bit nicely. It's just not optimized for mobile. And then mobile actually has their own language. And we include the designers for mobile in our reviews, but we don't actually enforce or do anything with the mobile stuff as much. It's more, that's where the language makes more sense for us, where we're sort of saying, we've created this language, can you make sure not to break that language? But we're not, I think we have an iOS app and an Android app, and there's stuff that's native to mobile that we're don't override that for the system. You should make sure it actually works in the medium that it's in. So that's what we decided to do for mobile. And then marketing, so that's really interesting. When we first started this, we sort of went ahead and did this on product. And I would say maybe like a year and a half later, marketing was like, can we get in on that? We like that. And so we've been working with them really closely, and actually a person from the marketing, or we call it Brand Buzz, at HubSpot comes, again, and sits in on reviews or is included in a lot of the things that we're doing. And she's created, we share a sketch kit now, which is new. It definitely adds, I've heard feedback, it's like sketch kit's a little big now. But at the same time, there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of sharing there, and I think there's just a lot of opportunity for things to get lost if we don't keep it together. So we've been doing that, so keeping one sketch kit. And we don't actually enforce that on the marketing side. There's like a couple people over there who do. So that answer your, yeah, cool. So how am I doing on time? You good?
Hi. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm curious, 2 years after the launch, have you seen the activity of requesting for new features, for new issue components or reporting issues? Has that slowed down, or is it always active? And is that a metric of success?
That's a big question. So it ebbs and it flows. I would say that there definitely was a lot of upfront work that we did, and it's definitely trickled down. But I would say that so our first product, the marketing product, has an editor. And so there's actually a bunch of stuff that we did not do in the first round that we're doing now. So it ebbs and it flows in that way, where now we're going through all of the editor stuff and providing the language and the style to that. So now it's kind of going back to being kind of a lot of work. But on the original components, haven't seen too much of it. It's just like a steady, we have over 60-ish teams. And we have quite a few more teams. And for me, at least like the growth of the teams and the rate of those issues has not been the same. So that, to me, that's an indication that we're doing pretty well. I don't know if I can. Is there someone with a microphone? Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much for this. What were some of the biggest challenges starting this process?
Biggest challenges. I think actually, so the first lesson addresses it a little bit, which is I think it can feel really big and daunting, especially because our product was really big. There was a lot of different components. And so I think it's almost just like the getting started, locking yourself in a room for 2 weeks and figuring out some of those things, and just making decisions, knowing that you can change them later. I think that was one of the biggest challenges that we had. And the other thing was, I could talk a little bit about implementation if that's interesting, but the front-end as a service team started out in a way that they were going to go around to every app and help them and do it for them, and we did that for 3 apps, and then we said, no way. That took way too long. We got to make this self-service. Teams need to feel empowered, and that's where actually the UI library, we sort of like made it into that process instead of the project. That was a big one. That was a challenge, but we just quickly moved it into solution. How do we solve this? But we learned a lot from that initial 6 months. I don't know who has microphones, but I feel like you can maybe just shout because. So is there something specific that you're thinking about for what you're going through that I could maybe?
So the thing is, like simple components are things that can easily build, but
Yep.
when it comes to a lot more complex components,
Yep.
how do we go about addressing those?
So I think there's probably 2 things. So the pattern stuff I talked about kind of gets to that. If you feel like you can only do some of the basic components, but more complex things or more opinionated things are harder to componentize, even just writing it down goes a long way until at least also, engineering catches up. But yeah, the other thing, so our front-end as a service team now is thinking about next year, and the 2 things that they're going to work on is like, so our whole app, I don't know if you've used HubSpot, our whole app is like tables and selects. It's like, it's like variations on those things. And so I think also understanding that, like look at kind of what your product is and what it's made up of, and maybe focus, like if we can make our select really good, that goes a long way for us in the use cases that we have. So also honing in on like if we could do 2 or 3 things really well, what would those things be? Did that answer your question?
Hey, we're going through this at the minute. I'm not on the team, but I know that one of the big challenges that we've had is dealing with CRO, so conversion rate optimization.
Yeah.
So if there's a change that's made and then it has a negative impact, then it doesn't go through. Have you had to deal with that at all, and how did you get past it?
So our marketing team has more of that than we do. We certainly measure success in product, but in a little bit of a different way. And I would say for this scenario, there was a couple of things we did up front to test it, and they were very much They were, qualitative. It wasn't quantitative. We did a bunch of like, you tried a bunch of concepts. How does this feel? Do you feel like it's sophisticated? Do you feel like it? So we did some of that up front just to make sure it was the right thing. But we didn't do a ton of quantitative, especially because the goal of the original redesign was not actually to change everything. It was mostly to be visual, so like starting to swap out and consolidate and simplify visually. So we actually didn't feel like it would have a huge impact. And then people can make better and bigger changes along the way. So we didn't have to do kind of that A/B at that moment. But we use NPS as a big signal at our company. And we had a lot of feedback about inconsistency and just a lot of pain around it that we don't have anymore, really. It's really, it's the next level up that they feel that pain, but it's no longer, everything's more consistent and they have expected behavior, so we don't hear that anymore. That was sort of our signal. That helps.
Sorry, so to your point where designers come and go, I'm really curious about your onboarding process and introducing this component library to them.
Yep. Well, so hopefully they've been using it. Like a lot of times you're a designer and you're hopefully using it, and then you join the team. We haven't really had anybody brand new to the company and then brand new to the Canvas team. So we do have an onboarding process for our designers that goes through Canvas. There's a bunch of materials and a bunch of, do like a 101 class for people to kind of go through it. So they sort of hopefully have some idea. But the other thing that we're doing is we have the team that's currently there overlap with the new team and teach. So there's like 2-ish weeks, maybe it should be a little bit more, overlap there, and we buddy them up and say, cool, you're going to work with this person on an issue and see how that works, and come to our reviews, see how that works, and so there's a little bit of a transition time, and then it's up to them, and they kind of take it from there. And so just to be clear, I'm still involved in a lot of that, so to keep a little bit of the continuity, but mostly for the review, mostly to make sure we're really aligning with what we've decided to date. Does that help? Cool. Any other questions? No? I'll also be at the booth afterwards, so if you have questions, feel free to come find me. But that's it. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Yay.